Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Laith Marouf. Laith is a Beirut-based journalist who is covering Israeli assault and occupation of parts of Lebanon and also Palestine. Laith, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Great to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
If we could begin by your analysis about the situation in Lebanon, particularly since March 2, there are reports about the Zionist entity killing 2,400 people in Lebanon with an additional million people displaced. One report today says that 62,000 buildings have been destroyed. If you can describe what has happened since March 2 in particular.
Yes, obviously the Zionists have the ability to massacre civilians and destroy civilian infrastructure. But as we see, they have zero ability to have military victories on the ground when they are fighting Hezbollah. And this is why they are lashing out, or they were lashing out on the civilians through the war, those 45 days. And as we see right now, because they weren't able to achieve any military victories during the fighting, they're trying to have some permanent positions, total destruction of areas that they're occupying during the ceasefire. And this is why Hezbollah has already began retaliating over the last 2 days openly. Today, there's been at least 4 Hezbollah operations attacking Zionist occupation positions inside Lebanon, as well as the gathering positions of those troops inside occupied Palestine, in the north of occupied Palestine. Those numbers you mentioned, 2,400 killed in Lebanon in those 45 days, at least 100 of them were medical staff. There was as happened in Gaza, the Zionists decided to target the easiest things to target, which are, in this situation, medical staff that are in their hospitals, or the paramedics in the paramedic stations and in their ambulances. Just an hour ago, in the town of Taybeh in the south of Lebanon, there's a convoy of journalists and observers that were passing, and the Israelis attacked the convoy, killing people in one car, and then began bombarding the area where there is multiple journalists that are now stuck. The Red Cross and the ambulances can't reach them. There's clear threat to their life. These journalists are some of the most prominent here in Lebanon, including one journalist. Her name is Ahmad Al-Khalil from Al-Akhbar newspaper. So overall, what we can see is the Zionists can kill people, can target journalists, can target medical workers, but they cannot have any military victories. And about the mass destruction, 62,000 housing units. Over the last few days, our teams at Free Palestine TV have been going south, even behind the imaginary yellow line that the Israelis drew. And we've seen tens of unexploded ordinances in houses, in fields. With further inspection of these unexploded ordinances, we discovered that the Zionists are using very old munitions, some of them going back to the 1970s, from stockpiles that they had gathered for a possible war with Egypt in the 1970s. And a lot of missiles that are were supposedly targeting the roads, but actually hit beside the road. So clearly they don't have enough even guiding systems that are modern left to use. So, All of these things indicate that the Zionists are running out of munitions. That's happening also for the United States, of course. Looking at the tanks that they have in the fields here in Lebanon, there's a lot of older generation Merkavas. They lost at least 200 tanks in Lebanon just now in this battle, and they've already lost 1,000 tanks in the battle in Gaza and Lebanon in 2024, 2025. So they are running out of their most modern tanks, and they can't keep up in terms of their production. Their situation is very hard on the battlefield, but as we said, they can still continue to kill civilians. That's what they are good at.
I'll come to the ceasefire and the possible talks about an extension of the ceasefire. And there I'd like to understand from you a little bit about the divisions or the differences within Lebanon. But where I wanted to start actually is on the core issues like occupation of Lebanese land by Israeli forces, Israeli assault and attack on the people of Lebanon, on the need to delineate the borders. There seems to be a unanimous consensus in Lebanon, from the Druze leaders to the Beirut-based government of Nawaf Salam and President On, and of course Hezbollah. At least my reading has been that on this core set of issues, there is a consensus, and it represents a popular will of the people of Lebanon. So before we try to understand some of the differences and the complexities within Lebanon, if you could tell us a little bit about this core set of issues that Lebanon faces vis-a-vis the Zionist colonial entity.
Yeah. Look, right now in the south of Lebanon, the areas that the Zionists drew in their imagination with this yellow line include a lot of Christian and Druze and Sunni villages. And in fact, some of the areas that the Zionists are drawing as behind this yellow line that they want to depopulate include some of the most holy sites for the Druze sect. So this is not something that it's going to be acceptable to any of the populations in Lebanon. And this is why the government of Lebanon, who was, appointed by the embassy, American embassy, have really no legitimacy in terms of their negotiations with the Zionists directly in Washington, D.C. So popular opinions in the country against the occupation, the vast majority of the leaderships of the religious sects have spoken against that. The desecration of Christian sites have galvanized the Christian population, even though they are probably the most propagated to in terms of Western, imperialist media or Saudi media, to be against the resistance. They are, of course, saw what happened to their villages once the Israelis occupied them. So I don't think there is any way the Zionists can maintain this occupation. And in their best days, when there was a huge imbalance of power in the 1970s and 80s, they were unable to hold territory. So you can imagine with this, new sophisticated resistance that has access to all these guided missiles and guided drones and what have you, what damage it can do to Zionist forces attempting to hold to territory in Lebanon.
Israel wants to break down the state of Lebanon, as it wants to do the same thing in many parts of West Asia. And one of the strategies is to create division and civil war in Lebanon. And Lebanon has had a history of that. You've mentioned about the influence, or you were more categorical in saying the embassy in the U.S. embassy in Lebanon appointing the government in Beirut. If you can tell us a little bit about the kind of relationship between the government in Beirut and Hezbollah, because some of the analysis is very crude and flat, which says that it's one of pure antagonism. Others says that there is an element of cooperation and competition. So if you can break down some of that complexity and put the ceasefire in perspective of that.
Well, look, the difference between Lebanon and the rest of the region that the Zionists want to fragment is that really there is no such thing as Lebanon as a state. It never existed. The government of Lebanon or its military forces since 1942, since the creation of Lebanon by chopping it off from Syria, and never controlled the borders, never had monopoly over the use of force on its territory. And that's what defines a state. So, Lebanon is always in a state of anarchy. Okay, and every sect and every neighborhood and every region and every village takes care of itself. Okay, so to try to fragment what doesn't exist is a fool's errand. Okay, and this is partially why Hezbollah, as a liberationist movement in the year 2000, when it liberated Lebanon, chose not to take control of the government, and thus became the only liberationist movement in the history of humanity that liberated a country and didn't take control of the government. And so it was a choice that Hezbollah made, not only because it didn't want a civil war right after the liberation, but because there is no such thing that the state of Lebanon can offer. And right now is the same thing. If Hezbollah and its allies that represent the vast majority of Lebanese people want to, they can do a coup and in 5 minutes take over every government office and round up the government of Nawaf Salam and put them on trial. But the next day, the Israelis will bomb every government office, every ministry, every palace, every police station, because they will say Hezbollah is the state of Lebanon, right? So what Hezbollah has chosen right now is to let these house slaves, the prime minister and the president of Lebanon that answer to the United States and the Zionists, let them run wild, sign ink on paper that is worthless if they want to, because this government cannot face off with Hezbollah. This government that wants to service the Israelis and the Americans and cannot offer those services that it may want to. The military of Lebanon is too weak. It cannot attack Hezbollah. And if it does, there will be a mutiny inside the military because 60% of the soldiers and officers are from the Shia sect. The fascist Christian supremacist militias are a shadow of what they were in the 1970s when the Civil War was active. There's probably just a few hundred. Will be very generous to say, a couple of thousand armed, Christian supremacist militiamen, and the Wahhabi death squads, which is the final thing that the Americans and the Israelis may depend on, are across the border inside Syria, and they are too scared to attack Lebanon. They tried to attack Hezbollah twice over the last 15 months or 16 months, and they lost on the borders battles. And if HTS al-Julani moves his troops to attack Lebanon, Syria will fall apart. There's, in total 60,000 HTS fighters that are barely controlling the checkpoints across Syria. And if they withdraw them to attack Lebanon, the country will fall apart and every region will secede. So there's no real challenge internally or externally to Hezbollah except direct Israeli intervention and American intervention. And that's what they're already doing. So adding a signature on a paper by the prime minister or president of Lebanon will not change the reality on the ground in Lebanon.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the axis of resistance as we are in the middle of these negotiations and also blockade, I mean, in however ways you'd like to define, between Iran and the United States. And that issue is linked up with Lebanon. Of course, Israel wants to de-link that in many ways. How would you describe the impact of the Iranian resistance against the US bombing on the axis of resistance overall in the region?
Yeah, like we saw a statement from Ayatollah Mushtaba Khamenei saying that they consider every member of the axis of resistance as a sovereign part of Iran, and they will defend it as such. So I think the fact that Iran just repelled the American invasion possibilities and repelled the attack and destroyed American base of power in Western Asia have uplifted the resistance across the region. Any doubts that people had in their mind after the fall of Syria or that depressing moment is gone. That high that the Zionists felt after the Wahhabi death squads captured Damascus and their troops entered Syria and reached almost the doors of Damascus, the Israelis, that high is now gone. The Zionists know that they cannot defeat the axis of resistance without American direct involvement. And now American direct involvement has shown its limits. And clearly, the United States cannot defeat Iran without the use of nuclear weapons. Therefore, there's nothing that the US can do today different than what it did during those 45 days of war on Iran. Thus, the axis of resistance is on ascension. Yemen is most probably going to become a regional superpower, by itself, if we consider that there's a big possibility that Yemen will follow suit in terms of how Iran extended its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Even if the United States doesn't reactivate a war where Yemen closes up the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, why not Yemen extending its sovereignty over Bab el-Mandeb, which will make it a superpower in itself and bring it revenues to uplift the country from poverty. So, the future outlook is very bright for the axis of resistance members because of the successes on the battlefield in Iran, in Yemen, in Lebanon.
So Iran becoming a massive power in the region because of its performance during this war, and obviously, as you said, that the Beirut-based government cannot disarm Hezbollah, and the occupying forces, of course, cannot defeat any nationalist and anti-colonial forces, and so the overall impact on the resistance in Lebanon is positive, and you added the element of that in Yemen and in the Red Sea. So the follow-up that comes to my mind is what would be the impact of that strengthened axis of resistance on Palestine. We've been discussing Palestine for a while, so I'm very curious about your analysis on that.
Well, everything we're talking about is really about Palestine. And the existence of resistance in Lebanon, for instance, wouldn't happen if there was no Zionist occupation of Palestine and expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland. And therefore, similarly, the only thing that differentiates Iran from any other state in the region is that it champions the liberation of Palestine. That's the only reason it's being punished and blockaded and besieged and sanctioned for the last 30 somewhat years. So every win that the axis of resistance has right now will play into the liberation of Palestine. And as the United States exits the region eventually, and the Zionist colony finds itself without a imperialist sponsor, at that point, even the barefoot children of Gaza would be able to liberate Palestine by themselves. Okay, and now the only thing that we see, if we want to be ultra positive and just play this game of, let's say, the United States is gonna exit West Asia, and then the Zionist colony is left alone, and the West abandons its supply of weapons and what have you, and financial and economic and political, sponsorship. Well, Israel still has nuclear weapons, and we're already seeing the axis of resistance leadership think about that possibility. What's going to happen once the Zionists are abandoned? And clearly, somebody needs to come and pick up those nuclear weapons before these Zionist crazies drag all of humanity into a nuclear winter against our will. Therefore, we have to begin looking at the South African apartheid model when the world came together and dismantled the nuclear weapons of apartheid South Africa before the collapse of that regime. And yesterday, the Iranians, I think, began this process of trying to put this in people's minds in the West with their application at the International Atomic Energy Agency, asking for it to come into occupied Palestine and put all the nuclear weapons and nuclear program of the colony under its supervision. That's the first step, is to get people on the ground that can see where those weapons are, so we can work towards dismantling them. So when the moment of collapse for the Zionist colony comes, we all can breathe easily and not worry about a nuclear winter.
And how do you see the future path of the client states going forward as the empire gets weakened and takes the beating? And there are now talks about probably the slow death of the empire, but definitely a decline of the empire in the region. There have been client states. What is your assessment about the future of these client states? Definitely in the Gulf, but I'm thinking about Jordan, parts of Lebanon, of course, and Syria now. They're not just fundamentalists, but they are also client states of the United States. What is their future?
Look, much of the political structures in the region are artificial and unsustainable naturally, including these borders that the imperial powers put in at the end of World War I. And so what do I mean by that? Look at what's happening right now to the UAE. They just announced that they're basically bankrupt, and they're asking for a loan, financial aid from the United States. This is a country that has only 1 million citizens, with some of the richest oil and gas fields on the globe. Where did this money go? Clearly, their money is in the banks of the U.S. and the West, and it's already been confiscated. It used to be that these vassals would get enough money from the looting of their resources, maybe around 10% cut from their own gas and oil. They got like a little tiny part of it that allows them to have these, parties in the middle of the desert and glass towers, unnatural growth of populations in areas that shouldn't have high populations, and to manufacture a new cultural hubs for the Arabic people, while the destruction of the natural cultural hubs of the Arabic world, like Syria and Iraq and Yemen, is happening. So as soon as these vassals that are unnatural begin collapsing, things will return to their natural order. Sana'a, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo will re-rise back to their natural place as capitals of the Arabic culture and trade and population centers. Even Jordan, which didn't exist, Amman as the capital, was a little hamlet before World War I, before the borders were forced. North Jordan is just like the suburbs of Damascus, basically, okay? And so, these unnatural borders and these forced political formations of these vassal states, vassal leaders, will collapse as soon as the United States leaves. And this is, the natural order of things. When we talk about the liberation of Palestine, people think, well, there will be a liberation of Palestine and then a Palestinian state. But no, in reality, if there's a liberation of Palestine, the Sykes-Picot borders collapse. There will be millions of Palestinian refugees from inside Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon just marching in. And with them will be other millions that just want to go and visit Jerusalem for the first time in a century. And they're not going to return. It's the end of those borders. There will be no Palestine as a state. There will be liberation of Palestine, but that will lead to the collapse of all of the fabricated borders and the fabricated states that shouldn't exist anyways. And there will be a emergence of new political formations in the region. This is how dramatic these moments that we're living are. The liberation of Palestine, the exit of European military power from Western Asia are going to shift all these borders. And this is all because of the success of Iran, by the way. I think people haven't yet recognized how, crucial and global history changing the moment is of Iran expanding its sovereignty over the Hormuz Strait. It is as, time shifting as Jamal Abdel Nasser and Egypt extending their sovereignty over the Suez Canal and nationalizing it. And the war that came as a response to that by the Tripat attack in 1956, the British, French, and Israeli attack on Egypt, which they were defeated in, which led to their, France and the UK being demoted from being global superpowers to secondary powers under the coattails of the United States, which rose as the new superpower because of the 1956 crisis, Suez crisis. Today, the United States is ceasing to be the superpower because of the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz crisis that it lost. And there is no European power that can replace it as the hegemon within the European hierarchy. And therefore, the effect of the demotion of the United States from being a superpower because of this Suez Canal is even more historical in terms of how it's changing, because it's ending not only American power, it's ending Western European power that was built over 600 years. And another indication of this, and I know I rambled a little bit here, is when you look at Yemen and Iran being able to destroy the ability of the United States and the West to project power through naval blockades and naval invasions. This has been the core part of European power for those 600 years since the beginning of the Columbus invasion of the Americas. And that era now is ending because of the successes of Yemen and Iran.
Indeed, we've been discussing some of these significance of rise of Iran, particularly by regaining control over Hormuz. Reminds me of the moment of the breakdown of the Safavid Empire in 1732 or 1726, I guess. And since then, the advent of European colonialism that broke down Asian free trade in the region. We've been talking about integration of Iran into rising Asia and its prospect in trade and how the impact of that. Also, the impact on the petrodollar system as the client states would rethink about their relationship with the United States, and that might accelerate the process of UN-led order, or maybe if not UN-led, given the financial system within China is not as liberalized to become the single hegemonic world currency, but we can definitely see multi-layered global currency. I was curious to ask you about, as you spoke about some of these big alternatives and how breakdown of the political formations and redrawing, I wouldn't say redrawing of maps, but re-emergence of what is more organic to the region. I was curious about what could be some of the binding forces of these different movements. I'm thinking about some of the conversations in 1930s and the 1940s as visionaries at that time were seeing the end of at least a particular type of colonial world order. Of course, they never wanted the US order to take over the France and the British order, but they were talking about secular nationalism. Many were talking about or discussing about the role of religion. There was language emerging as some of those organic basis for people to come together. Of course, in your part of the region, we have religion as a key big factor. In other parts, there was communism. Looking forward, it seems, of course, very vague, but if you could spell out some of your thoughts about possible ways of binding what could otherwise appear as discrete and incoherent movements.
Yeah. When we go back to this idea that 1956 and the Suez Canal collapsed these empires into secondary power rates, it also propelled Jamal Abdel Nasser and Egypt into the forefront of the decolonization struggle. And, Jamal Abdel Nasser outreach to all these other leaders in the world that were fighting their own liberation struggles and formed the Third World Movement or the Non-Aligned Movement. And Jamal Abdel Nasser helped liberate half of Africa, basically, and was close friends with Lumumba and saved his wife and children. When he was getting assassinated in the Congo. These are all results of that, ability of Egypt to win that moment. Okay. Well, today it's going to be the same thing, in a different and bigger scale, in a reality where there is no first and second world where there isn't a capitalist camp and a communist camp that are fighting over who's going to control the emerging decolonizing peoples, right? Today, there is no such thing other than a American empire with all these components that are NATO and EU and GCC, and new merging superpowers like China and Russia that don't have a ideological motive for their relationships with the rest of the world, and they have no intention of being colonial or competing with peoples that are seeking liberation. So I think Iran right now is positioned to be the galvanizer of liberation movements around the world. And I think we will start seeing, because of how different this moment is on scale and this lack of dual polarity that existed during after World War II, there will be emergence of multiple polar world, different than even what BRICS was envisioning, because BRICS was shackled with two members that are really, vassals or very close to the United States, like India and Brazil, or the government of Modi and the government of Lula, who stood in the way of integration of other members that are more opponent of the United States, like Iran. So now Iran is emerging as the Muslim superpower, and there will be others that are emerging and aligning with it, such as, let's say, the Sahel Confederacy. We may see things happen in the Horn of Africa if Yemen is involved. Yemen and Somalia and Djibouti and Eritrea, those are all peoples that are intermarried. They have huge histories together. And as the Emirates and the Israelis exit the Horn of Africa, Yemen will be most probably playing a role in the liberation of that region. Similarly, South Africa is, in a prime position to begin looking at the region of South Africa, not only the country, and seeing how to mitigate the harm of colonialism, that fracturing of Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, and so on, which are really just the same and one people as South Africa. The sky is the limit, but Iran and the axis of resistance know and can see the effects of what they are doing and the ramifications of it globally that could be there. But it is up to other nations at this moment to, grab the bull by the horns and ride it. In fact, if any other nation on this planet starts a war with the United States right now, and I'm not talking about big ones like China or Russia, if a country in Latin America decides right now that it's going to go to war with the U.S. or be more assertive militarily, the U.S. is not in shape to fight any battles. It's abused its own munitions. It's down to like 25% of its stockpiles for its most advanced weapons, and it's bleeding economically.
I have one final question. And what kind of media do you, given both you and I are in media, in whatever way we define it, but we do consume, produce, we are part of that, whether we like it or not. And going forward, given these movements are so big and transnational in many ways. It's not just about a country standing up to imperialism, but it's also people within countries, even if their governments have not stood up against imperialism and Zionism, but there are people across the world who have done that. And with that, there is an element of media, alternative, or in whatever ways you define. My final question: what kind of media would emerge out of this new order that you just described?
Yeah, we're already over the last decade and have been seeing the emergence of this new media in different forms as this new multipolar world was emerging, and we couldn't define, its details, and we still don't. But over the last 2.5 years since the genocide in Gaza began and the Aqsa flood, it's clear that citizen journalism, on the one hand, that are the citizens that are not trained or are not doing this because they want to be journalists, but they're documenting their own life and the crimes against them or so forth, has emerged as a dominant way of communicating facts. Okay, there's no filter. There's instant moment of people, broadcasting this reality, and there's no way for mass media that it has billions of dollars to compete with it. Not because that of that one act of a citizen putting out a video, but because of the tsunami of citizens interacting with this citizen media and amplifying it, and even algorithms couldn't keep up with the flood of, for instance, of people sharing content from Gaza, citizens, journalist content from Gaza. All the censorship couldn't keep up with that reality. So we have seen how important citizen journalism is. The second part that we saw of change, of course, is the military journalism, the military media of Hamas or of Hezbollah or now Iran have been producing very, detailed and very well produced content from the battlefields that is more powerful than, let's say, those videos that ran in World War II in the cinemas. This is war propaganda that is high art. Okay, so that's another form of journalism that we've seen now that is innovative and different and a change. And finally, I would say when we look at projects like your channel, India and the Global Left, or Free Palestine TV, this, we can't define it as citizen journalism, but we can define it as, alternative, viewer-funded and viewer-supported content, where we don't have to wait for some big funding agency or beg from a political party or a government to give money. That the viewers are the ones that are funding it. They like this, they're going to fund it. Therefore, again, this is another way of us seeing how the older forms of media and media control are collapsing. And I don't think the imperialists have found solutions to control the narrative anymore, given these realities. Demonetizing somebody or deplatforming somebody doesn't take them out of existence. They just find ways to go around that and reach, and the media reaches the people, and they cannot keep up with this tsunami. If all of us are producing these shows, if all of us are documenting our life and broadcasting to it, this is a unlimited number of participants in the media production and the media consumption that the traditional media, no matter how much the budget is, cannot compete with.
Absolutely. We'll leave it there, Laith. Thank you so much for your answers and your time. Appreciate it, and hope to see you soon again.
Thank you very much, Jay. See you soon.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.